Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Professor Donald Gutierrez, author of the new book, Feeling the Unthinkable, Essays on Social Justice. Professor Gutierrez taught at the University of Notre Dame from 1968 to 1975, then joined the English department at Western New Mexico University. He received a New Mexico Eminent Scholar Award in 1989. He has published 6 books of criticism since retirement in 1994. He has published over 50 essays and reviews, most of which concern social justice and American state terrorism abroad. Professor Gutierrez, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you so much.
I think a good way to start the show today is by having you start out by reading an essay from your book.
Splendid, yes. The one I've chosen is called Patriotism and Country versus State, so I'm going to read a part of that. Quote, as the U.S. Patriot Act, October 26, 2001, ominously implied that the true patriot had best keep his mouth shut about his government's actions, no matter how evil, patriotism has become a word that would benefit from an iconoclastic embrace. One's immediate definition of patriotism is likely to be love of and dedication to one's country. This definition, though, is less one of instinct than of indoctrination, encountered as part of one's upbringing. The indoctrination shifts us into something ultimately darker or narrower when patriotism is further defined or implied to mean the approval of the foreign economic, quote, interests, end quote, and political military authority of one's country. The problem emerging at this point is that the idea of a country has subtly changed into another societal concept, the formidable abstraction and reality called the state. One can love one's country in the form of, say, San Francisco's cultural liberalism, New Mexico's green chili climate and mountains, the Midwest's festive sense of Halloween, autumn trees in Vermont, the New York theater, art, and baseball world, or individuals such as Thelonious Monk, Theodore Dreiser, Franz Klein, Eugene Debs, Dorothy Day, Suzanne Farrell, Cesar Chavez, or Amy Goodman. If, however, love of one's country means accepting the battle cry, "My country, right or wrong," for example, or American presidents threatening to declare war without congressional authorization, or permitting corporation boardroom decisions that kill jobs for hundreds of thousands of Americans and further poison our air and water, then I am not a patriot. Put another way, one must differentiate country and state to get a more satisfactory definition of patriotism, for to have to love John Muir and Amnesty International USA on the one hand, and Anthony Scalia and a regressive tax system on the other, is to ask for us a love that only a schizophrenic can provide. To entertain a civilized idea of patriotism, one might reverse conventional or unchallenged acceptances. This reversal could mean viewing as unpatriotic the 1950s House Un-American Activities Committee, or the White House's more recent warrantless wiretapping, or CEOs receiving bonuses on top of 7-figure salaries for executing mergers that raise product costs for millions of Americans and throw innumerable thousands out of work.
Professor Gutierrez, as I hear some of these descriptions of patriotism and country, I've often heard "my country, right or wrong," love it or leave it, USA. Mm-hmm. How do we go, or how should somebody go about talking to somebody about defining patriotism as not necessarily being a bad thing by questioning our government's actions?
Well, I think one has to make a distinction between what country really means and what state means. There's a sense in which the state is the abstracted sense of the country in its most ferocious military aspect. And if you want to see one example of that differentiation between state and country, you can see, for example, the way in which millions of Americans were against and protested against the Iraq War, the beginning of the war. A clear-cut case there of country versus state. Other ways of seeing it is that there's ways in which the state, whether it's the Pentagon or what have you, has associated itself with interests like the defense industry which has cost us, the people, billions of dollars over a decision over which we had no power whatsoever. So again, I think a decision there and a division between country, us, the people, and the state seen as that part of us that really we have little control over. And one of the ironies about living in a democratic society is that the more the state takes over, the more we are told what we should do, the more we are resisted making demonstrations against unpopular political gestures, the less of democracy we have.
As we think about patriotism over the years, and in particular in 2001, after 9/11, we saw the Patriot Act come into play, and also the discussion regarding torture. And you know, that's been in the news quite frequently. And you know, you have an essay called "My Country Must Not Torture in My Name," and I'm going to read an excerpt for you. The evidence is indisputable that the United States, through torture schools like the former School of the Americas or the funding of IMET programs, that's the International Military Education Training, of some of the most repressive regimes of our time, has caused an immeasurable amount of torture and vast terror amongst victimized populations in client states around the world, from Latin American nations to Indonesia and the Philippines. How has the United States used torture in the name of terror, on the war on terror?
It's used it by supporting right-wing governments in order to exert its authority in those countries for corporate ends. I happen to just accidentally have a list here of 16 countries which we've all supported, who all have had dictators. I won't read the whole thing, but it goes from Cuba with Batista down to Bolivia, General Suarez, or of course more well-known examples, the Shah in Iran. All these countries, I've just got 16, but that's just a selected list, were seen by forces in this country, which I would say were part of the state, that needed support from us financially, militarily, intelligence equipment, and so forth, in order to create what's been called a stability there, by which they mean a way by which the upper classes in those countries could make sure that nobody's going to protest about the fact that maybe the elite in those countries had, like, 90% of the power and the money. Now, if the United States is supporting those kind of countries, then there's something missing here in the way of any kind of genuine international democratic impact by our country. And that's one reason why, again, I see a real split between the country, the Americans, many Americans who really detest this kind of foreign policy by our government. But partly it's something that happens because our government is in cahoots with the major corporations here. Not all of them, but certainly enough of them to make for problems. And this goes way, way back to the late 19th century. The sugar interests in certain Latin American countries. Huge tracts of land owned by very wealthy upper class Latins, while the people trying to survive were just barely getting by in the most brutal economic and political and other conditions conceivable. If we're a democratic country, then why are we supporting these dictators? So that's one of my concerns. I think it's one that's pretty common to a lot of people, and not just liberals, but I think certain conservatives as well.
Now, some would argue that these are strategic moves for this country, that we need either military bases or, as you just mentioned, whether it's oil or whether it's sugar plantations, and that it's necessary, it's an evil necessity to associate with some of these dictators, some of these repressive regimes. And there is that argument out there, and that's, a lot of them would claim that that's what has made the United States be as successful as it has been.
Yeah, my problem with that approach would be that it really represents the interests of very powerful sectors of our society and not of the whole people. The corporate interests and investments in other countries have often been backed up by a big stick, that is, often by a bayonet. Let's remember what General Smedley Butler said, possibly the greatest Marine general in history, or at least one of the great ones. He said he was a gangster for Wall Street. He said he could have shown, the famous Chicago gangster, a few tricks about how to handle people. He said, Capone only handled 3 districts. I handled 3 continents for Wall Street, not for American democracy. So I think there's a key connection there between the interests of powerful people and corporations in our country and their need to, quote, stabilize the power structure in many other third world countries in order for the investments to keep going. But this has very little to do with any spreading democracy. One way I like to put it, because often enough the democracy, the economic interests have power behind them, is to say that we're in the habit of bombing democracy on other countries.
Let's go back to the debate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why is there a debate or the discussion of torture? Why is there a debate as to what torture is, or how it is defined in this country? And, you know, as it relates to the war on terror, and, you know, again, as an example of, you know, there being reports that using torture was the reason the United States was able to find out where Osama bin Laden was at.
Well, that's the thesis of the movie, Dark 030, or whatever it is, Dark 30, which has been highly criticized in some pretty good places. I think the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, The Nation magazine, because that's never been really been proven to be true. Often enough we get false information out of torture. In fact, some information we got out of one of the well-known Muslim terrorists ended up being false, but it was used as justification to attack Iraq. And I think the guy who was sort of the fall guy for that, in a sense, was Colin Powell, who gave a talk that gave the green light for that talk, and afterwards he felt like he'd been used, that the material he was given was false. Getting back to torture, well, as President Bush once said, we don't torture. Well, he's wrong. We do torture, and it goes way, way back. There are actually pictures in various books showing in the Philippines soldiers holding down a Filipino man, feet, arms, a bar across the man's mouth while water is being poured into him. This is back in 1901. We torture right here in some police stations. I'm not saying right here in Las Cruces necessarily, but Chicago. Commander Byrd got himself finally in big trouble in the 1980s by torturing African Americans, getting false intelligence out of them, false police. And one of the things that was done, and this was a whole other subject going into the whole concept of no-touch torture, is that the cops in Chicago used to hit their people with a Chicago phone book. Why did they do that? Because it left no marks. And that's become one of the key aspects of American and other countries' torture. Leave no marks. And then, you know, somebody looks at the person complaining about torture and they say, well, I don't see any bruises, I don't see any lacerations. Yeah, because they've been slammed or forced to stand on one leg for an hour. Try doing that. Remember Donald Rumsfeld's famous remark, well, why should they get 4 hours, you know? I stand behind my lectern for 10 hours. Well, yeah, but he can go to the bathroom whenever he wants to or have a cup of coffee. The other guys, after standing for maybe, try doing it for 5 minutes, they'd fall down, then there'd be some touch torture. They'd be kicked, they'd be hit, and then, you know, horrible situation.
As again, we discuss the issues on the war on terror over the last several years. Recently, there's been discussions on the use of drones. And, you know, this is known as the drone president. What is your opinion on the use of drone strikes?
I think they're horrible. They increased with Obama's presidency. This was, I think, a big shock to many people. The argument for them is that supposedly they prevent fewer Americans from getting killed being on the ground. And while there's truth to that, at the same time, they're creating enormous hatred and fear and anxiety among Muslim Arab people. And view the fact as well that I think the rate is now well over 700 children alone have been killed by these drones. I mean, it's, this always reminds me of a remark made by, and I always forget her name, Hemingway's third wife, and it's a terrible way to put it because she has her own kind of integrity, who said she'd like to take the generals for a walk on the ground to see the results of the bombs that have been dropped. Shattered bodies, heads decapitated, all kinds of horrible stuff, the result of these bombs falling. So that'd be one big argument against the drones. Another one has to do with the fact of the whole question of the legality, the constitutional incorrectness of drones. People not being given a chance to say whether or not they're guilty or not, to defend themselves and so forth. So there's all kinds of issues. Some of these get pretty technical, but there's a growing unpopularity with the whole use of drones. And the frightening implication, too, that they might be used more and more in our country as a form of surveillance. And that's another, well, the whole subject of surveillance is something else, but that's scary, too.
You accuse the United States of foreign policy hypocrisy in Chapter 2 of your book. Would you mind elaborating on this?
Well, just the whole idea of our seeing ourselves as the beacon on the hill, going way back to that sentiment, as the light of the world, as Madeleine Albright, who I like to call Madeleine Aldim, once said, we are the indispensable nation. I think those are dangerous attitudes. I think what we have to do is reach a point where we reach out to other countries and try to share our power with them, because sooner or later other countries are going to catch up with us one way or another. But in regard to hypocrisy, this is the basic idea that we are a democratic, free-loving country, whereas we seem to support regimes who are torturing and brutalizing and repressing their people. So I think that's one of the major aspects of democracy, plus our own racism here, towards Native Americans, towards African Americans, towards Hispanics, towards Asians. Building the railroads was a nightmare for Asian people. So again, more examples of that. I think one only has to go, and I haven't been to one, thank God, to one lynching to get an idea of a certain other character of American culture. And I just want to look at that book for a moment because this is from my wife's work. My wife died 18 months ago. It's called Revealing the Unthinkable, Feeling the Unthinkable. That's the name of the title. Her painting, which is as a part of it, is called Illuminating the Dark Side. Dark side, does that remind one of anybody? Well, it reminds me of Dick Cheney. We kind of have to go into the dark side, he said, sort of. And as one of his thugs, Cofer Black, once said, it's time to take off the gloves. And that's when the torture began big time. There was some of that before, but it really got heavy under Bush and Cheney.
Our guest is here on Fronteras is Professor Donald Gutierrez. He is the author of the book, Feeling the Unthinkable, Essays on Social Justice. What role, positive or negative, has the United States played in the Middle East, say, within the last 4 years?
Oh boy, I'd say it's played a pretty negative role. We've created enormous hatred over there because, after all, there are a lot of Muslims, from what one hears, who are not terrorists, who are not interested in destroying other peoples or other countries. They just want, some peace. They want a country in which the rich and the wealthy are forced to share some of their wealth and power. I think they want pretty much what most people want, what people in this country want, who are also getting swindled big time by the powers that be. So I think by supporting, as actually we've done for more than 4 years, the elites, and whether it's Egypt or other countries you could think of, Iraq. Remember the great scene of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, who is as bad as Hitler, another nonsense. We can see that things have not gone well there, and we've done everything possible to really increase hatred of this country and to create terrorists. So it's not just a black and white situation. It's hardly that at all. By which I don't mean I justify 9/11 by no means. It was an absolutely horrible act, but we didn't have to go to war to handle that. Many people much smarter than me have seen that as something demanding a police action. Getting bin Laden, some of the other people, and that might have had a lot to do with easing the whole kind of tension and structure with the Middle East.
Let's come back to the country, United States here.
Let's do that.
When it comes to social justice, what role can the common person play to achieve social justice in this country? And in your book, there's different topics of social justice. But if you were to pick one topic of that's important to this country as we look to progress, in the upcoming years, what role can somebody play, and what social justice issues should that be? That's important.
Well, there's all kinds of things. I think grassroots organizations are increasingly valuable because I think more and more people feel they can't trust Congress because Congress seems to be pretty much bought by the Koch brothers and other very wealthy people, and also at the control of the Pentagon. And just moving this aside briefly, if the Pentagon and the military gains too much power, then you have a movement towards a virtually fascistic society. As far as other things that can be done, well, I guess if enough people call up their congressman, it might have some impact. But I think the Occupy movement is extremely important here because it represents not just young people, and certainly not just hippies, you know, but a whole variety of people, middle class, banking people, people from unions, who are just getting swindled by the state of our economy, which, by the way, of course, is thanks to the banks, which were helped in a number of ways by Congress and by certain key people in the Treasury. The good thing about that movement is that it made people more and more aware of the incredible lack of distribution of wealth in our society. It's unbelievable. It's almost as bad as certain third world countries. And it doesn't look like it's getting much better. So that's something else. If people get more aware of that, if they join movements, if they write letters, we find ways of preventing private funds from going into the pockets of politicians, I think these things will help. Finally, we have to reverse citizens, what's it called? Which allowed undisciplined amounts of money from shadowy sources. Yeah, Citizens United, which I call Corporations United. I think it's more accurate.
Let's talk about corporate greed. You kind of touched upon that.
Yeah, corporate greed.
Do government bailouts, corporate payouts, or golden parachutes, or record profits from the oil companies, how do they hurt the common person?
Oh yeah, immensely. Because it takes money from us and gives it to them. I think everybody's more and more aware that corporations are not taxed adequately. They have very low taxes, unlike other corporations in other countries. And the ratio of salaries in this country is something like anywhere from 1 to 100, or it's been even seen as 1 to 500. That is not an example of economic democracy. And if you don't have economic democracy, you don't have political democracy. So that's part of the problem right there. Want to restate the question again?
Well, we're running out of time, and I appreciate you coming in. And you definitely want to talk about this because you ended your book with an essay titled "Poets, Poetry, and Social Crises."
Yeah.
And you did this after discussing things like corporate greed, war on terror, and torture in your book. Why did you feel that it was important to end the book with this essay?
Well, to put it as briefly as I can, I think it's because I felt the poet, or the poet in quotes, the person who's sensitive to moral and human issues, deserves more of a voice in our society. Whenever you have some decision about whether to go to war, what do you have on the big media? You have a former Secretary of Defense, a current general. These are the hard-nosed pit bull types who get on there and say, yeah, we're ready to go to war, let's go get them. I think you need somebody who's a little bit more humane. And some of these other types could have some humanity, but often enough they don't. They're the only ones chosen. Like a poet, like somebody with kind of a developed humane sensitivity. You say, wait a minute, we don't have to do that. Just think of what happens when all these bombs drop. Well, let's think about if there's a real necessity to attack such a country, who are we attacking it for? What are the interests behind? In other words, to ask analytic but also sensitive questions, the questions which indicate what actually happens to the human body when bombs thrown at it. And one of the great heroes for me who gets into this is Dr. Helen Caldicott, one of the great champions of anti-nuclear war. So that's one reason why I chose a poet, because they speak the truth if they're good poets. They're not compromised, and they'll say things that the generals and the former secretaries of defense and state won't say. Or if somebody does say something, like a certain Secretary of State who said we should nuke Iran if they attack Israel, that's pretty sloppy language. And I think somebody there who's more humane would say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Think of all the innocent Iranians that you'd be nuking, putting into dust or whatever. So in other words, you need somebody who can get on the main media, who's not afraid to speak the truth, who's got no kind of commitments to some kind of force that says you can only say this and nothing more. How you get those people up there in those kind of powerful media, that's one to work on.
In 30 seconds or less, immigration. Do you feel that that's a social justice issue?
Absolutely. This is something that most people don't seem to be aware of, but in some ways, this country is to a large extent responsible for some of the immigration problems that have occurred because of NAFTA, sending down enormous amounts of goods down there, which impoverished Mexican labor, put people out of work, caused some farmers to commit suicide. What do? If you want to support your family, you go where the work is. Well, where is the work? It was up here in the United States. often enough Mexican immigrants have been misused, abused as cheap labor, no working rights, what have you. And so I think it's a very complex issue. It's not just a matter of these Latin people coming across our border. Well, don't forget too that that border was once Mexico, and the United States took that away in 1846, 1848, and the famous war at that time. So there's been some subtle imperialistic activities here which are easily glossed over.
Is there a viable solution?
Yeah, I think so. It might have to do with being a little bit more open to what the whole issue is, trying to understand what has caused the immigration, and setting up certain standards that aren't impossible by which people can become citizens. And of course there's enormous reaction against this, especially from the Republicans, because they know that Mexican Americans and Mexicans or Hispanics tend to vote Democrat. So there's a political aspect as well.
Well, we could probably discuss immigration for quite a long time. Yeah. And I want to thank you for joining us here on Fronteras and for coming in and discussing your book, Feeling the Unthinkable, Essays on Social Justice. And Professor Gutierrez, thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Donald Gutierrez, author of the book, Feeling the Unthinkable, Essays on Social Justice, from Amador Press. And thank you for watching.